Hi everyone, welcome back to Alice and the Giant Bookshelf. Today I'm going to be talking about the top 5 English novels. Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel, or welcome if you are new. My name's Alice and I have way too many books, and today I'm going to be talking about English novels. So, Shelly Swearingen recently tagged me in her video all about the top 5 English novels, and this is something that's been under discussion on Booktube in the past week or so, and I believe started out with Eric Carl Anderson over on his channel as a conversation about people's favourite English novels. Luckily for me, I actually haven't read as many classics as a lot of people on Booktube, so I feel like I had, luckily, a smaller range to choose from. Shelly chose to talk in her video about her top 5 English novels since starting on Booktube, and I thought that today I would do the same because it makes narrowing it down a lot easier. I've been on Booktube for just over a year now, and it has been definitely a year in which I've read more classics than I ever had in the past combined. So there's a good pool of English novels to choose from, thanks to events such as Jane Austen July and Victober, which have really encouraged me to read a lot more of the greats, the great English novels. However, there are authors who I will come to later who I have not read books of, who I feel would feature in everybody else's top 5, but I simply haven't read those authors yet, and I do intend to rectify that as soon as possible. I also would like to talk at the end of the video about the other books that I feel would make, or potentially could make, my top 5 if I was to do my top 5 English novels that I've ever read. And I think that top 5 will look a lot different than the top 5 from the past year, and to be honest, I don't know how they would combine to create an ultimate top 5, which is why I haven't actually done my ultimate top 5. So anyway, my top 5 English novels of the past year and a bit, and I'm going to talk about them in order of publication. So the first author to mention, and probably the first author that a lot of people mentioned in their top 5, would be Jane Austen. It's tricky to pick from Jane Austen's novels. I have not read Pride and Prejudice or Sense and Sensibility yet, so they are ruled out. So for me, to get on this list, it would be between the book Persuasion, which I was reading when I started on Booktube, which I think is very different to some of Jane Austen's other works that I've read. It's a more mature and thoughtful book, and I personally think that the relationship in it is the most romantic, or it has the most romantic moment in it, of all of the Jane Austen books that I have read. Remember, I haven't read Pride and Prejudice, so yeah, I'll be fixing that in July. So Persuasion is definitely a massive contender for this list, but when I was reading it, and bearing in mind I hadn't read that many classics in the lead up to it, I found that the first half of it took me a little bit of a while to get into, and there's a scene sort of in the middle of this book which really kicked off my interest in the storyline and made it a lot more interesting for me. So potentially Persuasion, but I would have to say that I think the book that I read in Jane Austen July slightly pips it to my favourite Jane Austen, so I would have to go for that, which is Emma. I know Emma is not a lot of people's favourite Jane Austen. I just think Emma is a wonderful book with so much humour, and there's so much going on in Emma, which is what for me makes it very slightly pip Persuasion to the post. I love watching Emma as a character mature and sort of being in on the joke with the author as we see Emma make these mistakes, and as we see her grow up a bit, and as we see her matchmake. So I really, really do love the story of Emma, and I think that would probably be the first entry into my top 5 English novels. The second one I also read in Jane Austen July, but it isn't a Jane Austen book, and that is Frankenstein by Mary Shelley. This was my first time reading Frankenstein last year, and I really can't believe that this was written by Mary Shelley when she was a teenager, essentially. I think this is a very underrated book in some ways. There's a lot in Frankenstein that you just don't necessarily expect from your sort of general knowledge of Frankenstein. It's a really interesting book and I think really, really well written. So Frankenstein would be my second choice from the past year for my top 5 English novels. Thirdly, we come to a book that I buddy read in Victober, and that is my entry in the list for the Bronte sisters. And again, maybe this isn't the book that you would expect. I haven't read all of the Bronte's combined works, but I read in October The Tenant of Wildfell Hall by Anne Bronte. And this was a buddy read with Nikki over at Red Dot Reads, and it was one of the best buddy reads that I've done because we were just able to really, really enjoy this book together, and the talking about it with Nikki really added to the book for me. So Tenant of Wildfell Hall would definitely be a really strong contender for me for the best English novel, because it's really, I feel, underrated and really unexpected. I'm not going to say too much about what happens in the book, because the joy of it for me was discovering something I completely was not expecting, and coming to a classic work without any prior knowledge of it is a really rare thing, I think. So I really, really enjoyed being able to do that with The Tenant of Wildfell Hall, and I think it's a book that was well ahead of its time. I think it's a massively, massively underrated Victorian novel. But yeah, it's a wonderful, wonderful book, and of the Bronte books I've read so far, which is one from each sister, I would definitely rate this as the top Bronte book for me. Next we get to the most difficult part of this top 5. Now, how can you have a top 5 English novels without including Charles Dickens? I don't believe you can, personally, because all of the Charles Dickens books that I have read, and that is only 4 at the moment, and I'm excited to read many more and hopefully all of the rest of his work. But there's so much in Dickens. Dickens is such a clever writer, and I think once you tune into that language of Dickens, you can really appreciate the book so much more. For me, it's tricky because in the last year I have read 2 Charles Dickens novels and 1 novella. The novella was actually my favourite, but I've not counted it here because it's not a novel. So it's between 2 for me, and the 2 are Great Expectations, which was one of my favourite books of last year, and Our Mutual Friend, which I actually finished off this year on audio. So the choice between these 2 is really difficult for me, not because they are similar, but because they are so very different. If I was recommending a Charles Dickens book to a beginner, I would recommend Great Expectations, and I have. Great Expectations is a good book if you like first-person narrative, you like a book that kind of focuses on one character and the characters around him and takes on that story. Our Mutual Friend is extremely different to that, because Our Mutual Friend is almost exactly the opposite. It focuses on so many different characters and so many different storylines, and I loved the way that Dickens did that and brought it all together at the end. However, I do think that maybe fans of books such as Great Expectations and David Copperfield would not maybe love Our Mutual Friend as much as I did. So which one goes into my top 5? It's very difficult to say. Great Expectations has a very special place in my heart because I just really loved this one, and I loved following Pip, even though Pip really annoyed me in parts of this story. But I think this has some of Dickens' greatest characters. But what this had for me was a great character arc for the main character, and I loved that in the same way that I loved David Copperfield, which I read before this year, so it's not being counted. On some days I would say that Great Expectations is my favourite Dickens. However, on other days I would definitely say that my favourite Dickens so far is Our Mutual Friend, because this one just had so many different interesting characters. I loved the way their voices were done on the audiobook I was listening to, and I just found that really, really interesting, and the way all of the different characters connected to the one central idea was really interesting for me. And it's something completely different from Dickens. So very, very hard to choose between those two, but I would definitely 100% include a Charles Dickens novel in my top 5 English novels. And finally, for this top 5, I would choose another buddy read from last year, Rebecca by Daphne du Maurier. This one I actually read with Shelly Swearingen herself, and it was one of our first buddy reads. I think it was Shelley's first buddy read and it was my second. I just absolutely loved this. I already felt that I knew the story of Rebecca really well. In fact, I actually thought I had read the book years ago, but it turned out I think that I'd actually just watched the Alfred Hitchcock film of the same name. And I just thought that this was wonderful. I think du Maurier's prose is just beautiful, and the way she describes the nature, the sea, the various different plants is wonderful, but even more wonderful is the use of the setting, Manderley, as a main character. For me, the main character in this book isn't the eponymous Rebecca, it isn't Mrs. Danvers, scary as she is, and it certainly isn't the second Mrs. De Winter, our nameless narrator. For me, Manderley is the central character in Rebecca, and I love it. I think this is the best example you can find of a house as a character, and no one can convince me otherwise. I just think this is a wonderful, wonderful book, and I loved reading it with Shelley last year, so this would definitely hold a place in my top 5 English novels, and it would probably even hold a place up against some of the of all time options that I'm about to mention. So, everybody else who's made this video, apart from Shelley, has come up with some runners-up. I don't have runners-up from last year. I've been strict and stuck to those 5, 6 if you count the 2 Dickenses. But I do want to mention what would be included if I was doing this of all time. So I also want to talk to you about 5 novels that I believe are great English novels that could easily make a top 5 on their day. And these are all books that I didn't read while I was on Booktube. These are all books I've read in the past. So, again in publication order, we have Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte. I read this at the beginning of 2020 in a time where I read about 3 classics back to back, and it was really the start of a classics revival for me. It really made me want to read more classics, and it really got me into that mindset that classics were actually classics. They were held in high esteem for a reason. This has some great stuff in it. I think if you were looking for one of the Bronte sisters' books to put on this list, a lot of people would choose Jane Eyre. I think Jane Eyre definitely has potential. I think probably up against the books from last year and the books from all time, Jane Eyre might slip out of my top 5, but it's still a great book. Secondly, I wanted to give a mention to The Woman in White by Wilkie Collins. I've read 2 Wilkie Collins books, The Moonstone and The Woman in White, and I think The Woman in White is probably my favourite. I love the way Wilkie Collins writes, and when you're reading these books you can really see how they paved the way for mystery, which is, as you know, my favourite genre. So I definitely would give a mention to Wilkie Collins as an English writer who would potentially deserve to be mentioned in this sort of a list. For my personal top 5 of all time, I definitely think that this book would stand a chance of making it, and that is The Hound of the Baskervilles by Arthur Conan Doyle. In my opinion, this is the best of all of Arthur Conan Doyle's novels, and far superior to his other Sherlock Holmes novels. For me, only beaten by his first collection of short stories about Sherlock Holmes, and obviously this isn't a list for short stories. So Hound of the Baskervilles would be a very strong contender for me if I was forced to pick my top 5 of all time. A lot of you probably will be thinking by this point in the video, there's only 2 books to go, and here's a video where Alice hasn't mentioned Agatha Christie. It's not going to happen. Of course it's not going to happen. She's an English author. And my choice wouldn't be the same as what I think some people's choices would be if they were including an Agatha Christie in the top 5 English novels. I think the 2 best thought of Agatha Christie novels, and definitely 2 of my favourites, are And Then There Were None, and of course Hercule Poirot's most famous adventure, The Murder on the Orient Express. However, the book that has my heart from Agatha Christie, and a very, very clever Poirot indeed, is Five Little Pigs. So Five Little Pigs by Agatha Christie, as my favourite Agatha Christie book, would have to be in contention for the top 5 English novels of all time, because it's Agatha Christie. I love Agatha Christie, and I think that her work is just... I think her work speaks for itself. She's not one of the best-selling authors of all time for no reason, and Five Little Pigs, in my opinion, is her finest outing for Hercule Poirot. I think there are ideas in this that are just quiet genius, whereas the other 2 are super famous. This one is away in the background, just being great. So this would be my pick for Agatha Christie if she was to make it onto the list. And finally, this book would definitely make it onto my top 5 English novels of all time, because this has been my favourite book of all time for a very, very long time. And I'm definitely due a reread to check if it is still my favourite. And I don't think I have seen this mentioned on anybody else's list. And I would be very surprised if it is on anybody else's list. But that is A Clockwork Orange by Anthony Burgess. I think that this would deserve a place in my personal favourite top 5 English novels, because I just love this book. I love what Anthony Burgess does with language. Yes, this is full of violence and full of horrific events, but the thing that grabs me about this, and the thing that has made it my favourite novel for all these years, is the language. It's written in a completely different language, and I can see how people would struggle with that, but I've always loved, like, when authors can use a different and made-up language to tell a story, and I thought Anthony Burgess did a perfect job of that. So this follows Alex and his droogs, and they have a very violent life, and Alex's life is changed by being arrested and being put through a therapy to remove his violent streak, basically. The film of this was banned. The book has probably been banned at some point, but controversially, Anthony Burgess's A Clockwork Orange would definitely make my top 5 English novels of all time, because it's just been my favourite book of all time for a long time, and it is an English novel. It's very possible that this is actually a novella though, because my copy here is only 150 pages, so let me know in the comments down below whether you think this would qualify as a novel. If it doesn't, then all the more chance for the rest of these to get onto my top 5. So that is my sort of 2-part answer to the question, what are your top 5 favourite English novels? You'll notice a lack of some authors who I know a lot of people would include on their favourite English novels. Hardy, who I haven't read at all, Trollope, who I haven't read at all, and Eliot, who I haven't read at all very famous Victorian English novelists. So yeah, I do need to start on those. Do let me know in the comments down below if you have a recommendation for me, a great English novel of any kind, or one particularly by those 3 that you think I should start with. As I say, I'm not that well read in classics, so there are plenty more to go. I think that this is a very thought-provoking discussion, and I will definitely come back to it when I've read more English novels as well, and I definitely think that lots more people should join in the discussion too. So with that in mind, I'm going to tag lots of people for this. If you don't want to do it, that's absolutely fine. If you do want to, I would love to see what your top 5 English novels are, because I just think this is such an interesting topic of discussion, and I just know that most people's top 5 will differ completely. Oh, and the other author I wanted to mention who I haven't yet read, who I've seen on every single top 5 so far, is Virginia Woolf. So if you'd like to tell me which is your favourite Virginia Woolf novel, do let me know in the comments down below. I've wanted to read her for a very long time, and the likelihood is I will probably start with Mrs. Dalloway or To the Lighthouse, both of which draw me in quite a bit. But if you have an alternative, do let me know. People I'm going to tag, I thought I would tag Nikki at Red Dot Reads, because as I said, we had a very enjoyable buddy read of The Tenant of Wildfell Hall last year. I'm also going to tag a lot of channels that I love watching who read a lot more classics than me, and I think they will find this quite difficult because they've read so many classics. So I'm going to tag Ray over at Ray of Sunlight, Milena at Milena Reads, Tori at Hufflepuff Discovery, Marissa at Blatantly Bookish, and I'm also going to tag Mitzi Reads and Writes, Jennifer Loves Books, Booking with Debra, and also Emily at Novelle Novels. Yeah, so do chat to me in the comments down below about your top 5 favourite English novels from any time period. Feel free to go and check out the other channels that have done this. I will try and link all the videos that I've seen so far down below, especially Shelly's, who tagged me. The other thing that Shelly said when she turned this into a tag was feel free to put whatever spin you want on it. So Shelly chose to do like books from the past year on Booktube, but you could easily do of all time. You could set yourself a certain time period to make it easier. You can put whatever parameters you want onto this tag. I meant to say at the beginning as well that I didn't include any children's classics because I felt that I could do a whole nother top 5 of those. So maybe I will another day bring you my top 5 English children's novels, which would be a very, very hard list to choose because I have so many. Yeah, please do comment down below. I'd love to hear from you. Please consider giving this video a thumbs up if you enjoyed it, and consider subscribing if you haven't already. That's all from me today. I hope you will join me again soon for another video all about books here on Alice and the Giant Bookshelf. Bye for now.